The divorce papers hit the table like a gunshot. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound in the Dragon Crown Casino's private VIP room was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant echo of slot machines one floor below, a world away from the silence that had swallowed this room whole. Kang Jitai sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his jaw set, his dark eyes unreadable, his fingers laced together like a man who had already decided the outcome of a war and was simply waiting for the other side to admit defeat. He wore a black suit that cost more than most men in Seoul earned in 6 months. His cufflinks were platinum. His watch was a Patek Philippe. Every detail about him screamed power, and every man seated around that table, 12 of the most dangerous criminals in the Korean underworld, understood that this man did not make decisions lightly. To his right sat Yuna Park, 28 years old, breathtakingly beautiful in a way that felt almost calculated, her red dress cutting a sharp contrast against the black leather of her chair. She held a champagne flute loosely between 2 fingers and wore the quiet, satisfied smile of a woman who believed she had already won. And at the far end of the table sat Amara Okafor Kang. She had not flinched when the papers landed in front of her. She had not gasped, had not looked up at her husband with pleading eyes, had not done any of the things that the room was clearly expecting. She simply sat there in a midnight blue dress, her natural hair pinned elegantly above her neck, her dark skin catching the warm chandelier light in a way that made her look almost statuesque. She looked at the papers for a long moment, the way a surgeon looks at a patient, not with fear, but with calm, clinical assessment. One of Jitai's senior lieutenants, a thick-necked man named Director Cho, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He exchanged a glance with the man beside him. Neither spoke. Jitai broke the silence first. "I think you understand what this is," he said, his voice low and even, the voice of a man who had ordered executions using the same tone. "There is no discussion needed. I've made my decision." Amara looked up from the papers. She looked directly at Jitai, not with anger, not with tears, but with something far more unnerving. Clarity. "I understand perfectly," she said. She reached into the leather portfolio in front of her, produced a pen, her own pen, a slender gold one she had carried for years, and she signed. Slowly, deliberately. Each stroke of the signature was composed, unhurried, like she was signing a business agreement she had already reviewed 100 times and found entirely acceptable. The room watched in stunned silence. Yuna's smile faltered slightly. This was not the scene she had imagined. She had expected tears. She had expected Amara to beg, to plead, to make a spectacle of herself that would confirm everything Yuna had been whispering into Jitai's ear for months, that Amara was weak, that she was just a decoration, that she didn't belong in this world. Amara capped her pen. She slid the papers back across the table. Then she reached up to her left hand, removed her wedding ring, a 3-carat diamond set in white gold, and placed it on the table beside the papers. Not thrown, not slammed. Placed. With the same calm precision with which she had done everything else. Then she looked around the table. She looked at every single face. The lieutenants, the enforcers, the financial officers. She looked at each of them long enough to make them feel seen, and then, finally, she looked at Jitai one last time. "You should be careful," she said quietly, "about who you replace me with." She stood up, picked up her clutch, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds. It felt much longer. Then Yuna laughed, a short, sharp sound designed to cut through the tension. "Well," she said, swirling her champagne. That was easier than expected. But Jitai was not laughing. He was staring at the door. And Director Cho, who had served this syndicate for 19 years and had seen more violence than most people could imagine, was staring at the wedding ring left on the table, and feeling, for reasons he could not entirely explain, a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand who Kang Ji-tae was. Not the version of him that appeared in newspaper articles. The shadowy businessman connected to real estate and private equity. The real version. The one that every criminal organization from Seoul to Tokyo to Macau knew and feared. Ji-tae had taken over the Kang syndicate at 32 years old after his father died, under circumstances that were never officially investigated. Within 5 years, he had doubled the organization's revenue, eliminated 3 rival factions, and secured monopoly control over the most lucrative smuggling corridors between East Asia and the Pacific. Weapons, pharmaceuticals, people. It didn't matter. Ji-tae moved it, taxed it, or destroyed anyone who tried to move it without his permission. He was not simply powerful. He was systematically powerful. The kind of man who didn't just win. He restructured the game so that winning was the only possible outcome. His lieutenants were loyal not out of love, but out of a rational understanding that betraying Ji-tae was a death sentence. He was not cruel for sport. He was precise. He punished when punishment was necessary, rewarded when loyalty warranted it, and he never, ever made a decision based on emotion. Or so everyone believed. Because here was the thing that very few people had ever stopped to examine too closely. The Kang syndicate had not always been this strategically brilliant. Before Amara, there had been 2 major strategic disasters. A warehouse deal in Busan that collapsed and cost the syndicate $40 million. A failed alliance with a Japanese organization that ended with 3 dead and a 2-year turf war. These were the kinds of errors that Ji-tae's father had made repeatedly. Big, loud, brutish mistakes born from arrogance and impatience. After Amara, those mistakes had stopped. The Busan port routes were renegotiated through a series of quiet conversations that nobody had publicly claimed credit for, but that Director Cho knew, if he was honest with himself, had been Amara's suggestion. The Japanese alliance had been repaired not through violence, but through a cultural mediation that had been, again, attributed to Ji-tae's growing diplomatic intelligence, but which had originated in a quiet conversation between Amara and one of the Japanese organization's wives, a conversation that Ji-tae had dismissed at the time as social small talk. He had taken the outcomes and given himself the credit. Amara had never corrected him. She had arrived in Seoul 5 years earlier in a way that had confused everyone. She was not what anyone expected Ji-tae to bring back from an international trip. She was not Korean, not from any of the criminal family bloodlines that usually cemented these relationships, not particularly interested in performing the role of Mafia royalty. She was 27, Igbo Nigerian, educated at the London School of Economics, with a postgraduate degree in international trade law, and possessed of a quietness that most people mistook for passivity. She attended the right dinners. She wore the right clothes. She spoke Korean well enough to navigate social situations, though she was strategic about when she demonstrated that fluency. She did not demand to be included in meetings. She did not push for authority or title. She simply existed, watched, listened, absorbed. The wives and girlfriends of the other syndicate members had initially tried to dismiss her. "What does she know about this world?" one of them had whispered at an early dinner. "She's an outsider. She's decorative." Ji-tae brought home a beautiful trophy and dressed it up in designer clothes. They had stopped saying that after the first year. They couldn't point to exactly what had changed, but there was a quality to Amara's presence in a room that over time became impossible to ignore. When disagreements broke out between factions, she would sometimes say one quiet sentence, just one, that reframed the entire conflict in a way that made resolution feel inevitable. She never raised her voice. She never showed her hand. She simply offered perspectives that somehow, mysteriously, turned out to be exactly right. Director Cho had said it to Jitai once, privately, after a particularly complicated territorial dispute had been resolved through exactly the kind of nuanced three-party agreement that Amara had suggested over breakfast. "Boss," he had said, "your wife sees things we miss." Jitai had smiled and changed the subject. He did not like being told that a woman had insights he had missed. It was a blind spot he had never examined and never intended to. And Yuna Park, who had understood Jitai's psychology with the sharp accuracy of a woman who had studied powerful men her entire life, had known exactly which nerve to press. She had started appearing in Jitai's orbit 8 months before the divorce. Casino events first, then private dinners, then exclusive parties that Amara, who preferred smaller gatherings, often declined to attend. Yuna was electric in those spaces, laughing at all the right moments, deferring to Jitai in ways that felt like admiration rather than submission, making him feel not just powerful, but fascinating. Like the most interesting person in any room. She had started the real campaign about 6 months in, when she began planting small seeds of doubt with surgical precision. "She seems so distant," Yuna had said one night, lying beside Jitai in the dark. "Like she's always somewhere else in her mind. Don't you feel that? Don't you feel like she's never really here with you?" Jitai had said nothing, but he hadn't told her to stop. The next week, "I just wonder sometimes if she even understands this life. Like, does she get what it takes? What you carry? I don't think she fully sees you, Jitai. I don't think she's ever really seen you." The week after that, "She's not useful to you, that's what I'm saying. She doesn't contribute anything real. She just exists beside you. You deserve someone who fights for you. Someone who belongs in your world." 6 months of this. 6 months of small, precise incisions, each one barely noticeable on its own, all of them together bleeding out a marriage that had, despite everything, been the most stabilizing relationship Jitai had ever known. He had never told Amara about Yuna. He had assumed she didn't know. He was wrong about that, too. Amara had known about Yuna Park for 4 months before the divorce dinner. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had used those 4 months to do things that Jitai would not begin to understand until it was far too late. The morning after the divorce dinner, Amara was gone. Not gone the way women usually leave, with packed suitcases and forwarding addresses and tearful calls to mutual friends. Gone the way a ghost disappears, completely without trace, as if she had never existed in a solid, trackable form. Her penthouse apartment, which Jitai had kept in her name as a formality, a separate space she had insisted on maintaining from the very beginning of their marriage, which he had always found mildly eccentric, was empty. Not just vacated, cleared. No furniture, no personal items, no documents. The place looked like it had been professionally decommissioned. Her phone went to a disconnected tone. There were no airport records matching her passport, no immigration records, no credit card activity, no CCTV footage at any of the transit points the syndicate's network monitored. Jitai's intelligence team spent 72 hours on it and came back with nothing. "She's Nigerian," one of the tech analysts offered, as if nationality were an explanation. "She probably went home." "Find out," Jitai said flatly. They couldn't. He spent about a week on it, slightly longer than he wanted to admit, before deciding it didn't matter. She had signed the papers. She was gone. Whatever wounded pride had sent her running was her own business. He had a syndicate to run, and a new partner to install. Yuna moved into the mansion with the confidence of a woman who had been planning the interior redesign for months, which it turned out she had been. New furniture arrived within a week. The staff who had been with Jitai for years, several of whom had quietly been loyal to Amara in the small, practical ways that household staff show loyalty, were replaced. Yuna wanted a clean slate. She got one. What she did not get was respect. The transformation was almost painful to watch, for those who watched it. The syndicate's senior lieutenants were men who had operated in violent, hierarchical structures their entire adult lives. They understood power instinctively, where it lived, what it looked like, what made it real versus performed. And what they saw in Una Park was performance. All surface, no depth. She began inserting herself into meetings she hadn't been invited to, offering opinions on operational decisions, with the breezy confidence of someone who had read a few books about organized crime and believed that made her qualified. She called Director Cho by the wrong honorific in front of junior members. A small thing, but the kind of small thing that lands like a slap in rooms where hierarchy is everything. She told Jitai at dinner that one of his longest-serving financial officers was probably skimming, based on no evidence whatsoever, just instinct. The financial officer had been loyal for 11 years. Jitai, to his credit, did not act on that accusation without evidence, but he also didn't shut her down. That was the thing people began to notice. The new version of Jitai with Yuna, was different. Softer in the wrong ways, more reactive, more easily flattered. The disciplined, calculating precision that had made him the most feared boss in the Korean underworld seemed to be running in background mode, while something louder and less strategic had taken the foreground. Director Cho said nothing. He was not a man who expressed concern verbally, but he began keeping very careful notes. Then the attacks started. The first one seemed like bad luck. A weapon shipment from a port in Incheon simply disappeared. 3 containers, worth roughly $8 million, gone between the warehouse and the transfer point. The port workers were questioned. Nobody knew anything, or claimed not to. The second incident, 3 weeks later, was harder to dismiss as bad luck. Police raided 2 syndicate warehouses in Gyeonggi Province simultaneously, at 3 a.m., with precise, almost surgical accuracy, hitting exactly the right locations, seizing exactly the most compromising inventory, the kind of raid that doesn't happen unless someone gave law enforcement a detailed map. The third incident was the one that made Jitae's blood run cold. A convoy of 3 vehicles transporting one of his senior men to a secured location was ambushed on a secondary road outside Incheon, not by police, by a rival organization. The rival gang hit the convoy at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right location, on a route that had been changed at the last minute using a protocol that only 6 people in the entire syndicate knew. His senior man survived. Barely. He arrived back at headquarters with a broken arm, and a story that made Jitai sit in silence for 20 minutes after hearing it. They knew, the man said. They knew everything. The time, the route, the backup route. Someone gave them everything. Jitai gathered his most trusted people in a room and went through the list of who had access to each compromised operation. He was methodical about it. He went through each incident one by one, mapping access points, cross-referencing personnel. There was one name that appeared in the overlap of all 3 incidents. One person who had had knowledge, directly or indirectly, of all 3 compromised operations. He stared at the name for a long time. Amara. She had been gone for months. She had disappeared without a trace. She had no known criminal connections, no history of operational involvement in the syndicate's actual work, or so he had believed. "It's not her," he said finally, and closed the folder. Director Cho said nothing. He looked at the table. "I said it's not her," Jitai repeated, with slightly more force. "Of course, boss," Cho said. "What would you like us to do next?" Jitai didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about that morning 5 years ago when he had watched Amara at a trade conference in Lagos, before they had spoken, before he had introduced himself, watching her move through a room full of powerful men, speaking to each of them briefly, leaving each conversation seeming more interested in her than when it started, collecting information through pure social intelligence, the way other people collected business cards. He had thought at the time that she was extraordinary. He had then spent 5 years standing next to that extraordinary person, and slowly, systematically, failing to understand what he was standing next to. Yuna's fatal mistake came in the 7th month. She had been trying for some time to prove her value to the syndicate, to demonstrate that she was not, as she was beginning to sense she was perceived, merely an attractive presence that Jite had installed in a position she hadn't earned. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted to do something that mattered. So she had gone, entirely without Jitai's knowledge or authorization, to open a back-channel negotiation with the Huang organization, a rival syndicate based in Busan that the Kang syndicate had been in quiet conflict with for 2 years over shipping route percentages. Her idea was to broker a deal, show Jitai she could handle diplomacy. What she actually did was walk into a negotiation she didn't understand, with people she had catastrophically misjudged, and offer concessions that were not hers to offer. The Huang organization took her seriously enough to extract as much information from the conversation as they could, then dismissed her, walked away from the table, and used what she had revealed to undercut the Kang syndicate's next 3 shipping contracts with third-party brokers. The losses were somewhere between $18 and $23 million, depending on which financial officer you asked. Jitai found out on a Tuesday morning when 2 of those brokers called simultaneously to inform him that they were no longer available. He didn't shout. That was the terrifying thing about Jitai. When he was truly furious, he went quiet. He sat in his office for 3 hours and did not speak to anyone. When Yuna came in at noon, excited to tell him about her negotiation initiative, he let her finish the entire story. Then he said, very quietly, "Get out of my office." "Jite, I was just trying to—" "Get out of my office," he said again, and something in his voice made her take a step backward without consciously deciding to. She left. He sat alone and did something he very rarely did. He thought honestly. He stripped away ego and desire and the particular stupidity that had gripped him for the past 1.5 years, and he looked at his situation clearly, the way he had always looked at everything before Yuna had arrived, and begun rearranging his judgment. What had the past year actually looked like? His most capable strategic partner had been publicly humiliated and divorced. His organization had suffered 3 major compromised operations. He had lost a significant financial officer's trust. He had allowed an unqualified, ambitious woman to operate in spaces that had taken him years to build. He had lost somewhere between $20 and $30 million in a single unauthorized negotiation. His lieutenants moved differently around him now, more carefully, more guardedly, in ways he recognized as the early signs of eroding confidence. And somewhere out there, completely invisible, Amara Okafor was doing something. He didn't know what. That was the most unsettling part. The Bangkok International Summit was not publicly advertised. It was known only to those who were invited, and invitations were extended only to organizations of sufficient weight in the global criminal economy. Jitai had attended the previous 2. He arrived at this 3rd summit expecting to sit near the top of the hierarchy, as he always had. Perhaps not the most powerful man in the room, but among the top tier, his Asian operations, and his reputation preceding him. He noticed the energy in the room immediately. Something was different. There was a quality of anticipation that felt unfamiliar. The conversations he walked into kept stopping and starting, the way conversations stop and start when everyone is waiting for the same person to arrive. He heard 2 names repeated in multiple languages across different corners of the room. The African Alliance. Madame Okafor. He stopped moving. He stood very still in the middle of the room, and the blood drained slowly from his face. "You know her?" said the man beside him, a Thai organization head named Prakit, who had known Jitai for 6 years. "I know that name," Jitai said carefully. Prakit raised an eyebrow. "She's remarkable. The African Shipping Alliance she has built in the past year. I've never seen anything come together so fast. She controls 7 major West African port systems, private security infrastructure across 4 countries. She has relationships with 3 separate international banking networks that I spent 8 years trying to get access to. He paused. She walked in and had those relationships in 6 months. Some of us are wondering if she was building them long before she made herself visible. Jitai said nothing. Nobody knows much about her background, Prakit continued. She doesn't volunteer information. She's extremely private, very quiet, very smart. He chuckled softly. Terrifyingly smart, actually. I had one conversation with her last night, and I spent 2 hours afterward trying to figure out how much she'd gotten from me, and how little I'd gotten from her. The doors at the far end of the room opened. A woman walked in. The room changed. There was no other way to describe it. The air changed. The temperature changed. The conversation changed. Everything pivoted toward the entrance, with the unconscious, unanimous pull of a crowd recognizing something significant. She wore a white suit, tailored perfectly, a slim gold necklace at her throat, her hair natural, and her presence enormous in a way that had nothing to do with noise or theater. She walked like a woman who had decided where she was going before she entered the room, and the room had simply arranged itself to accommodate her arrival. Amara Okafor, but not the Amara who had sat at that syndicate dinner table in Seoul, not the quiet, elegant wife standing slightly behind a powerful man. This woman walked at the center of a space that was entirely hers, and the people around her moved in her orbit rather than the other way around. One by one, the most powerful criminal organization heads in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and West Africa stood to greet her. Not performatively, not with the political theater of power demonstrations. They stood the way people stand when they actually respect someone. Jitai stood also, because not standing would have been conspicuous. He stood, and he watched her greet Prakit, watched her exchange words in what sounded like flawless Thai, watched her turn to a Russian delegate and say something that made the man laugh with genuine warmth, watched her move through this room of extraordinarily dangerous people, like she had been navigating rooms like this her entire life. Because he was beginning to understand, she had been. She saw him. She did not react. Not a single flicker. She looked at him the way you look at an acquaintance you had expected to see at a particular event, acknowledged his presence with a brief, composed nod, and then turned to receive an introduction from the summit's host. Jitai felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Fear. Not physical fear. Something worse. The fear of understanding. Too late. The full dimensions of a mistake. She agreed to speak with him privately, because he asked formally, through the summit's protocol officer, and because, as she explained to the woman beside her afterward, it was the closing of a chapter, and chapters deserved proper endings. The room they met in was a small anteroom off the main hall, furnished simply, city lights visible through the tall windows. Jitai was already there when she arrived. He was standing, which she noticed. He didn't sit down when she came in, didn't perform his usual posture of authority. The lean, the stillness, the deliberate occupation of space that powerful men used to remind you of their power. He was just standing in the middle of the room, and he looked, for the first time in all the years she had known him, like a man who was unsure of himself. She sat down. She did not invite him to sit, but she did not tell him to stand either. She simply waited. "Congratulations," he said, and he almost sounded like he meant it. "What you've built is significant." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. Silence. He looked at her for a long moment. "How long?" he asked. "How long was I planning this?" "Yes." She considered the question the way she considered most questions, not performing the consideration, but actually doing it. "The connections I made at the West African ports," she said. "I began building those in my second year in Seoul. But honestly, Jitai, the understanding of what was possible and how to build it, that came from sitting beside you for 5 years. You taught me a great deal. You just didn't realize you were doing it. He absorbed that. And the attacks, he said. My shipments, my warehouses, the convoy. She looked at him calmly and said nothing. That was you, he said. You had built extraordinary infrastructure, she said, which was neither a confirmation nor a denial, and both at once. Some of it needed to be redirected. Directed toward your network? She tilted her head slightly. He exhaled. Something old and complicated moved across his face. You never said anything, he said. When at the dinner. You never argued. You never told me what was at stake. You could have told me. Told you what? She asked, with genuine curiosity in her voice. That you were making a mistake? You knew, Jitai. You knew, and Cho knew, and 4 of your lieutenants knew. Knowing wasn't the problem. You wanted what you wanted, more than you wanted clarity. He had no answer for that because it was true. So this is revenge, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Is it revenge when someone uses the freedom they've been given? She asked quietly. You made a decision. I made use of the outcome. That's not revenge. That's intelligence. You built an empire in 1 year. I laid the groundwork for 5 years, she corrected, gently but precisely. The year was just the visible part. He looked at the floor. He looked at the window. He looked at the ceiling. He was, she realized, genuinely grappling, not performing, grappling, not preparing a counter-argument, but actually sitting with the weight of what he had done, and failed to do, and lost, and would not get back. The woman I replaced you with, he started. Made several very expensive mistakes, Amara said simply. I know. How do you? I know a great deal about what happens in your organization, Jitai. I always did. A brief pause. That hasn't changed. He looked at her then, and for the first time there was something raw in his expression. Not entirely calculation. Something more, a human. Was there ever a version of this, he said, where you told me, where we built something together, officially? She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, for just a second, something moved in her expression that might have been old feeling, or old grief, or the shadow of a different life that had been available once, and was no longer available now. There was, she said. For about 3 years, there was. He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man, absorbing a verdict he had handed himself. And now? He asked. She stood up. She smoothed her jacket. She picked up the slim portfolio she had brought in and tucked it under her arm. Now, she said, with a composure that was total and final, you have what you chose, and I have what I built. She paused at the door. She turned back to look at him one more time, and there was in her eyes not triumph, not contempt, but something that was perhaps the most devastating thing she could have offered him, honest assessment, simply seeing him clearly. The same quality she had always had in that room 5 years ago, that he had always failed to fully understand. You didn't lose a wife, Jitai, she said. She let the pause fill the room completely. You created your greatest rival. She turned, and she walked out. He stood in that room alone for a long time after the door closed. The sounds of the summit continued on the other side of the wall. Voices, movement, the careful, layered conversations of powerful people negotiating the boundaries of their worlds. And somewhere in the center of all of it, he knew, Amara Okafor was back in that room, standing at the center of her own orbit, receiving the kind of respect that wasn't given, but recognized. He thought about the first time he had seen her, Lagos, at that trade conference, the way she had moved through the room, like she already knew where every conversation was going to end up. He had thought she was extraordinary. He had been right. He had just spent the next 5 years reducing extraordinary to convenient, and then to invisible, and then to inconvenient, until the only option that made sense to him, the worst option as it turned out, was to push it away entirely. He thought about Director Cho saying, "Boss, your wife sees things we miss." He thought about all the things she had seen. He thought about the 5 years of decisions that had gone right, and how easily he had claimed that credit, and how thoroughly it had blinded him to the source. He thought about Yuna, the manufactured charm of her, the deliberate, targeted campaign she had run to dismantle something she had never bothered to understand. He thought about how completely he had been managed, a man who prided himself on seeing manipulation coming from a mile away, who had spent 2 decades operating in an environment where everyone was always angling for something. He had been managed so cleanly, so methodically, that he hadn't even felt it happening. That was perhaps the most humiliating part of all. When he finally walked back out into the main hall, Crockett caught his eye from across the room. The Thai organization head gave him a brief, curious look, the look of a man who had noticed something in Jitai's expression and was filing it away for later analysis. Jitai nodded back, composed himself, and moved through the room. He did not approach Amara's group again. Not that night. He watched from a distance, the way he had watched Yuna arrive in his circle all those months ago, except now the sensation was entirely different. Then it had been hunger, that shallow, destructive hunger that had cost him everything. Now it was something closer to honest, sober comprehension. He watched Amara navigate that room, the precision of her, the patience, the way she gave each person exactly enough and held back exactly the right amount. And he understood, too late and completely, what he had spent 5 years living next to without ever truly seeing. She glanced at him once, briefly, from across the room, not challenging, not performing, not rubbing anything in. She simply saw that he was there, registered it, and returned her attention to the conversation in front of her. That was the last thing that broke him, in the quiet, internal way that things break in men who do not break visibly. She was simply done with him, not angrily, not dramatically. Just done. With the clean finality of a woman who had closed a chapter properly and had a great many more chapters ahead of her that had nothing to do with him whatsoever. He left Bangkok the next morning. His flight back to Seoul was quiet. He sat in the front of the private aircraft, drinking nothing, saying nothing to his staff. Director Cho, who had traveled with him, sat 3 rows back and asked no questions. He was a man of great situational intelligence, Cho. He knew when there was nothing useful to say. Somewhere over the South China Sea, Jitai opened his laptop and looked at the strategic operations report his team had prepared. Shipping routes, revenue projections, partnership status. The machinery of an empire that was still largely intact, but had in the past year shed something essential, some quality of invisible, reliable intelligence that had kept it running cleaner and sharper than it should have, by rights, been able to run. He closed the laptop. He stared out the window at the dark water below. He thought about what she had said. You didn't lose a wife. You created your greatest rival. The Amara Okafor who had walked into that Bangkok summit room was going to be, he now understood with absolute clarity, the most significant force that the Kang Syndicate would face in the next decade. She had 5 years of insider knowledge of his operations. She had an international alliance that was growing faster than anything he had seen built in his career. She had relationships with port authorities, private security networks, banking channels, and criminal organizations across 3 continents. She had, somewhere in the architecture of the past year, quietly redirected a portion of his own infrastructure toward her network. And she had done all of it, while appearing to be nothing more than an elegant, quiet wife standing slightly behind a powerful man. The most dangerous thing about Amara Okafor, he understood now, was not what she knew or what she had built. It was that she had always been exactly this, from the beginning. The woman in Lagos moving through the room, collecting information through pure social intelligence. The woman in Seoul giving one quiet sentence in a room full of arguing men and watching the argument resolve. The woman sitting at a syndicate divorce dinner, signing her name in calm, composed strokes, removing her ring, looking at him one last time. You should be careful about who you replace me with. She had known. Standing in that room, signing those papers, she had already known exactly where she was going. She had looked at him across that table, and she had seen the full shape of the future. His, hers, the syndicate's, with the same clarity with which she saw everything. And she had said the only true thing she was ever going to say to him again. And then she had walked out of his life and into her own. He had watched her go, and felt surprised that she wasn't devastated. He had been looking at the most powerful person in the room and seeing someone who needed his protection. In the months that followed, the Kong syndicate would stabilize, but it would never quite return to the quiet, precise excellence of its peak years. Jitai would make smart decisions and recover ground, and eventually restore most of what had been damaged in the year of Yuna's occupation of his judgment. He was still formidable. He was still feared. He would remain a significant player in the Asian criminal economy for years to come. But the African alliance would grow faster and smarter, and the further it grew, the more Jitai would recognize in its structure and strategy the fingerprints of everything he had failed to value when it was standing quietly beside him, night after night, offering one calm sentence that changed the shape of every room it entered. Director Cho would eventually request a private meeting with Jitai, 2 years after Bangkok, and would place on the table a detailed intelligence report on the African alliance's operations. He would do so without commentary, without, "I told you so," without any expression whatsoever. He would simply lay it on the table, the same way Amara had laid a wedding ring on a table in Seoul, and wait for Jitai to read it. Jitai would read it. He would close it. He would sit in silence for a while. Then he would say, "She's extraordinary." And Cho would say, "Yes, boss. She always was." If you've made it this far, then you already know. This story was never really about a divorce. It was about what happens when you spend years standing next to greatness and calling it ordinary. It was about the blindness that comes when ego and desire overrule observation. It was about a woman who understood that the most powerful move in any game is the one your opponent doesn't realize is a move until the game is already over. Amara Okafor didn't need Jitai's validation, his title, or his protection. She never had. She needed his proximity, his network, and his unconscious generosity with information. He gave her all three for 5 years, freely. And then, in an act of breathtaking strategic carelessness, he handed her the one thing she couldn't have taken for herself: her freedom. The rest was always going to happen. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to let it begin. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about what you might be overlooking, who in your life sees things you keep missing, what doors you've been standing in front of without realizing you're the one holding them closed, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about power, intelligence, patience, and the long game that quiet people play in loud worlds, subscribe right now, drop a comment telling us what hit hardest, and give this video a like so that more people find their way here. The next chapter is already waiting. Don't miss it.